much.
Thank you. Brilliant, thank you, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be part of this wonderful symposium. This has been, I've learned a ton already the last 2 days, so thank you for the kind invitation. I'm going to talk about digital therapeutics, so we're going to move out of sort of complex molecules, as you heard, and move into truly digital therapies. I will speak a bit about, and there's a bit of a disclaimer here, which is that while I was on sabbatical 5 years ago, I spent time with the Health Innovation Hub, which was an independent think tank working with the German Ministry of Health to think through digital transformation issues. And many of the policies I talk about today, in particular in Germany, I'm German American, will be insights from my time, not just thinking about this, but actually speaking with the people in the Ministry of Health who implemented policies for the reimbursement of digital therapeutics. So what is a digital therapeutic? We have a lot of really smart folks in this audience, but I don't know if everyone actually has a working definition. So digital therapeutic is health software intended to treat or alleviate a disease, disorder, condition, or industry by generating and delivering a medical intervention, this is quite important, that has demonstrable positive therapeutic impact on a patient's health. So this is software as medicine. And we are truly talking about standalone software that has real clinical impact. This typically falls from a regulatory perspective under this caption of software as a medical device. You may hear the expression SAMD. This is not a cartoon character, but this is actually a technical definition that was written by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. This is a real thing. All of the world's medical device regulators, they get together every year, they have a big conference, and they agree on harmonized definitions for medical device technology. In this case, we are looking at standalone software that statutorily, by law, meets a legal definition of a medical device. It's software that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. And when they are doing therapeutic things, they're typically called digital therapeutics. There's also diagnostic software, which I will not be talking about as much today, but that also is included in the regulatory definition. There are other types of really important software, including software that people in this room are deeply familiar with, related to medical devices. These will not be my focus today, but of course there's expertise in the room. There's software that's integral to a medical device. So the software that powers our CT scanners, our MRI machines, many opportunities for innovation there and to build these products on top of that software, but I won't be talking about that software directly. And then, again, a deep expertise in this room. There's software that the manufacturer uses to either build or maintain high technology products, including medical devices, but also biologics, which we heard about already today. Okay, so I want to give you just 3 very simple examples, like what kind of stuff am I talking about? A well-known example is Reset from a company called Therapeutics in the United States, which has a storied history, I want to be clear. But this was the first prescription digital therapeutic to receive FDA authorization in this country. It provides cognitive behavioral therapy alongside medical management, so prescription drugs for people with substance use disorders. And these people have to be enrolled in a substance use disorder treatment program under the supervision of a doctor. And what they were able to show is that when you couple medical management with a software program to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy, you get better outcomes. They provide a dashboard for the clinicians to actually look at what's going on with their patients. Now 2 examples from Germany. These are 2 of the very earliest approved software products that are digital therapeutics. A product called Somnio, which may be hinted at through the name, is indicated for the treatment of sleep onset and sleep maintenance disorders. So basically insomnia. It teaches evidence-based and guideline compliant, these are important terms, content from the field of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So again, we see another CBT product. This is a bit of a trend. Indeed, a lot of the tools that we see emerging are taking content from evidence-based therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and implementing them digitally. Why does this lend itself to digital delivery? Well, you don't actually have to touch patients to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's actually quite formulaic. There are a lot of if-then algorithms that we use for the delivery of this content, so we actually don't need anything particularly complex. in order to digitize these treatment modalities. It's a 90-day course of treatment, and currently in Germany, the manufacturer gets about €225 per 90-day course of treatment for this app being given to patients. A final example, Vivera Health Labs, or from Vivera Health Labs. This was also a very early approval in Germany, and this supports patients with chronic back pain. And another area that we see a lot of innovation in is musculoskeletal disorders. And we already have a growing body of evidence that shows that for things like physiotherapy and the management of musculoskeletal conditions, we can get really good outcomes, clinically equivalent outcomes, by delivering half or more of the therapeutic sessions virtually, including using digital tools and AI-based tools, so that instead of actually going to a physiotherapist's office and standing there in awkward sweatpants, instead I could stand in my living room in front of my iPad and have an AI tool. If anyone has tried these tools, I can really recommend it. You stand in front of a tool, there's a bit of a star on your knee, and it corrects you. It says you're not moving your knee off to the left enough, and you're actually getting real-time coaching from an entirely AI-based tool. We see a lot of innovation in this space. This has been negotiated at a slightly lower price, but nevertheless over €200 per patient per quarter. So these are the types of tools we're talking about. I'll show you some data later. We also see a lot of innovation in the cardiometabolic space and in the neurology space in digital therapeutics. So what's the challenge? This all sounds cool. It sounds high-tech. There are a bunch of things that we imagine we could digitize nicely. So what's the problem? We have this growing number, and this is really, we've seen this meaningfully in recent years, of evidence-based, and I chose those words deliberately, digital therapeutics, but also tools for remote patient monitoring of patients with chronic diseases. But even the evidence-based and clinically validated tools have struggled to answer the question, who will pay for this? There's not an obvious answer. If you read my bio, I spent 10 years as faculty at Harvard Business School. This case about a company called Twine Health in the upper right was published. It's a very tiny font. The publication date of this case was March 2015. So this was over a decade ago. And we wrote a case about this company that basically said, this is a wonderful technology. So Twine Health was a spin-out from MIT. They were based locally here. They had run a randomized controlled trial with Massachusetts General Hospital here in Boston, which is one of the nation's leading academic medical centers. They had really positive results for patients with hypertension, for the management of hypertension. And they could not get anyone to pay for this. This was an evidence-based tool that existed 10 years ago. And so then 3 years later, my colleague Rob Huckman from Harvard Business School and I wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review about why apps for managing chronic diseases haven't been widely used and how to fix it. And we pointed out, look, of all of the possible parties that could pay for this in the healthcare delivery system, it's really only the insurers that have the right mix of incentives and resources to actually pay for these tools. The problem that we're running into, and we've been running into for a decade, is the insurers are not used to this. So pick any insurer in any country in the world. They don't have the internal expertise to actually evaluate what does good look like with these digital tools. Nor do they have the resources to understand we should pay for X but not Y, we should pay for B but only under circumstance C. And so this has been the challenge for truly over a decade. A fun story about Twine, even though I bet, has anyone in this room heard of them? I bet the answer is no. Okay, one person, maybe you're local. So Twine you've never heard of. They ended up being acquired by Fitbit. Fitbit, of course, was acquired by Google. So the DNA of this company actually lives on in consumer health products that Fitbit and Google, including, launched earlier this week. But this company did not make it as a standalone company. So that brings us to Germany. And this is another Harvard Business Review article that we wrote during my first months with the Health Innovation Hub, where I said, look, if you want to see the future of digital health tools, look to Germany. Why do I say that? So Germany created a pathway for regulated reimbursable digital health applications through an actual law in the end of 2019 that established something called the Fast Track process, which combines regulation by Germany's main drug and device regulator with a clear reimbursement pathway for the entire statutory health insurance system. You can read more about it here. There are good guides in both English and German. These applications, these digital therapeutics in Germany are referred to as DiGA, which is their German acronym. It's for Digitale Gesundheitsanwendung, which is all one very long word or phrase, but we're going to call them DiGAs. So what do we do with DiGAs? These are all the use cases. So I started with a few examples, but there are many other things we could imagine doing. We can do rehab, of course, as I discussed, monitoring for migraine. We have excellent evidence there. But we could also do diagnosis, so detecting sleep apnea, management of chronic diseases of all sorts, support during a specific course of treatment, for example, cancer therapy, including inpatient tools to guide patients and manage expectations and improve compliance during inpatient stays, as well as actual delivering of therapy, antidepressant, all sorts of social phobias, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what's so great about Germany? Well, first of all, we have the dubious distinction in Germany of spending the most in Europe per patient on healthcare. So there's a lot of money just sloshing around, and we don't get the best outcomes in Europe. So there's a real need to think about, can we spend this money better? And we have 73 million people in the statutory health insurance system. And these 73 million people, which is 90% of Germans, all necessarily have access to these digital health applications on prescription now. So this is not just a theoretically nice idea, this is already happening. So how does it work? The manufacturers need to demonstrate compliance with a bunch of key prerequisites. So you want to meet requirements for data privacy, for privacy and data security, software robustness, interoperability, et cetera, et cetera. Once you've done that, the manufacturer needs to demonstrate positive care effects. That sounds very generic. So what does that mean? That could be traditional medical benefit. These are things that people in this room are used to hearing about: morbidity, mortality, quality of life measures. And or, alternatively, and this is where things get really interesting, these so-called patient-centered structural and procedural effects. Now that sounds really jargony. I gave feedback at the time that I thought that this label is terrible. Nobody knows what that means. But here's what it means. And this is, I think, where things get very interesting, because now we can imagine using new data sets, and in particular new sources of data. We spoke just about an hour ago about data from wearables and real-world data from sensors that we can use in really creative ways to start to actually say, can we use these tools to improve access to care? A very simple example is language. So my former neighborhood in Berlin, I recently moved, my former neighborhood has one of the largest Turkish-speaking populations outside of Turkey. What if we can just take a validated tool and make it available in the Turkish language? Digital technologies are excellent for this. We know in terms of, for therapy, there is a huge shortage of non-native German-speaking psychotherapists in Germany. Most psychotherapists who are licensed to practice did their training in German, speak German. And so we suddenly have the ability for tools that actually work and have an evidentiary basis to make them accessible to a wide variety of people who otherwise wouldn't have access. And we can actually start to demonstrate this quite easily with adherence. These are digital tools. We can look at the metadata. We can see who's using the tool for how long, and we can start to get a handle on things that we could only dream of understanding when we're looking at things like traditional pharma. So it gets very exciting here. Where are we today? I actually confirmed these numbers. Where are we as of last night? I haven't checked yet today. There are 57 currently approved and listed apps that are on the market and fully available to everyone in the German statutory health insurance system. These are some data from earlier this year, which I've updated in parentheses. As of earlier this year, there were 53 products listed. Now it's 57 that are available for reimbursement. An increasing number of these are permanently listed, which means they've submitted updated evidence packets to the regulator. A reduced number are provisionally listed. That means more are moving towards permanent listing. And you can see from the indication groups, a lot in mental and behavioral health, but also musculoskeletal disorders, neurology, and endocrinological conditions. There's a bunch of other exciting stuff going on in Europe that we can't talk about today. We won't have time. France is very exciting, and I know we have overrepresentation of our French colleagues in the room today. France has done a lot of things that follow the German process. I think something that I'm most excited about, though, is this notion that we might harmonize things like regulatory and reimbursement requirements across European countries. Think about the products we were talking about earlier today. When we think about new biologics, they must be approved at the European level. They must be approved via the European Medicines Agency in recognition of the fact that for cancer, a patient doesn't have German lung cancer, a patient has lung cancer, and a patient is European, and, but the way that we're treating these digital therapeutics right now, it's as if a patient has German multiple sclerosis, and then a multiple sclerosis patient in France would need to access an entirely different product. That doesn't seem to make sense. I will say I've been part of a very exciting early stage working group from the European Commission to actually start to think about what would meaningful harmonization of digital tools look like across countries. I'll just mention one thing about France, which is in addition to digital therapeutics, there is a reimbursement pathway for remote monitoring solutions. These two are often referred to in the same breath and often match very well with one another. Okay, a few words about what happened in the United States, because I'm also American and we haven't talked about the US. We're standing in Boston. The US used to have, and I'll preview where I'm going with this, used to have something called a pre-certification program. It was a pilot program to help inform the development of a future regulatory model. It wrapped up abruptly about 3 years ago. The decision at the time was to focus on established manufacturers, but many of these were general tech companies. These are not necessarily healthcare companies. And the aim was to look at the developer and their practices rather than going line by line through their code. Why is that a problem? Taken strictly, if you think about what does medical device law say, it says that the regulator is responsible for inspecting the medical device and understanding all of its content. The literal interpretation of the law would say that the FDA actually has to read through the code behind software products to understand the safety and the efficacy of the products. The FDA is, at the moment understaffed, but generally staffed by a bunch of capable people who have a background in biomedical engineering, not in software engineering. And by the way, who actually reads code line by line anymore these days anyhow? Completely unrealistic. So the question instead was, do these firms have good software development hygiene? And based on good practices, can we pre-certify a set of firms? This has a bunch of challenges. So the FDA had outlined what they called a culture of quality and organizational excellence. And these excellence principles, I show you them. These seem like a wonderful idea. No one will argue that these are a good thing to have. We want patient safety. We want cybersecurity responsibility. But how do you actually implement regulatory policy that ensures these is actually a very tricky question. And we were not able to get good answers to how to measure these and what do best practices look like. So the FDA announced, actually rather abruptly, I was at a digital health meeting just up the road from here, and everyone was shocked at the time the pilot had concluded, determining that the approach described is not practical to implement under current statutory and regulatory authorities. My big takeaway from this is that it is a real vindication of the German model and what is now the French model, which is you actually need to create new legislative authorities because the things that we're trying to do, the types of innovation we're trying to create here just do not fit into our existing regulatory models. And so when we try to do something to shoehorn that in, it doesn't work. And this reflects what I think are a broader set of challenges in the regulation of digital medical devices. This is an article we published back in 2019 in Nature Biomedical Engineering called Challenges and Opportunities in Software-Driven Medical Devices. And I firmly believe that our regulatory processes, in particular what we see in the United States now, were not designed for software, and this leads to a bunch of challenges. What do I mean? So dynamic software development. This is totally antithetical to how medical devices and drugs and other therapeutics are approved. We approve a fixed product. We don't tinker with the molecule once we've brought a drug to market. Except with software, many of you have a device in your hand right now. That device is receiving push updates all the time because software is developed dynamically, not statically. Distribution issues. This is a practical question, but software is not distributed through medical supply chains. So how do we securely get good software into the hands of users when there's no hardware attached to it? It's actually much easier in many respects when that software is embedded in a piece of MRI equipment because we know how to get that MRI equipment into the hospital. With software, there's some logistical challenges. Then there are questions about, is the software itself hardware dependent or hardware agnostic? And who's accountable for that? So if I get an incorrect recommendation from a piece of software that takes information from a hardware device into an algorithm and makes a decision, who's accountable for the correctness of that decision? Of course, cybersecurity and privacy, we could spend days on this. And then some questions about longevity and transparency of manufacturers get very, very interesting in the software setting in a way that's not true for hardware. So Patrick, I'm going to pick on you because we sat together at dinner last night. Let's imagine I give you a knee implant tomorrow. You need a new knee. I hope not, but you get a new knee. I am your orthopedic surgeon. I select an excellent product for you. The manufacturer of your new knee goes bankrupt next year. This should never impact you as a patient because you got a good knee with excellent evidence of safety and efficacy from me this week, and whatever happens to the manufacturer down the road is truly not your problem, right? This is not true. What if instead I've given you a medical device, perhaps even an implantable medical device with built-in software, now the manufacturer goes bankrupt? How do we think about software maintenance? How do we think about maintaining backward and forward compatibility of software in settings where manufacturers are going bankrupt or being acquired? Whose responsibility is this? We have these actual questions we didn't have before. Payment and reimbursement models. The simple thing here is that we're used to selling software in SaaS models. And we are not used to selling medical devices in SaaS models, full stop. The way that these transactions usually work is that the hospital buys medical devices from the manufacturer in order to perform Patrick's orthopedic surgery. The manufacturer gets one payment for the device implants that were used in that surgery. It's this very fee-for-product, fee-for-service model. With software, that's not how we sell software. And so how do we think about this, in particular, when that software is going to be used at a broader level becomes very interesting, and we need to think about new contracts for doing this. That said, there are great opportunities. So problems can be fixed and products can be improved quickly and at scale. Let's go back to the example of, I give someone a medical device this week, and then we want to, now we say we come up with a real, instead of the manufacturer going bankrupt, I come up with a massive improvement for that medical device next year. Now, all of the existing patients can benefit from that improvement in a way that wasn't true. So if I came up with a better version of Patrick's knee next year, he would never benefit from it. But if I can improve the software, all existing patients can. We can also fix problems at scale, which becomes very interesting. Of course, the commoditization of hardware that we're seeing may drive down prices. And the data that we're collecting, and this is where I'm particularly excited as someone who does a lot of data science, can support a transition to value-based care and really high-quality real-world evidence in a way that hasn't been previously possible. So where are we today? The problem with digital therapeutics is we don't understand these products very well beyond the pivotal trials that typically are randomized control trials that have already been conducted. We have a bunch of unanswered questions about US reimbursement, and these remain, and I will show you a picture to convince you of this, a deterrent to innovation, both directly and indirectly. What has in effect happened in the United States is in the absence of some sort of central decision-making process, nonprofit and third-party organizations are emerging to basically tell payers what they should be paying for in ideally a neutral way. My conflict of interest here, so an organization that I'm on the board of is the Peterson Health Technology Initiative, which many of you have heard of. The PHTI is a third-party organization that has been created to do technology assessments of digital health tools, basically in the vacuum, in the recognition of the fact that payers don't know what to pay for and they're not making these decisions proactively themselves. So let's have an organization that can do benefit assessments, can do technology assessments and say, look, this class of products seems like it's a good investment for insurers and this class is, but there's no central process in the United States. This remains a deterrent. But we can actually see R&D and innovation incentives taking hold in places like Germany. So this is a graph. At my lab, we've actually built a database of all of the digital and digitally enabled clinical trials in the United States and Germany. We're adding other countries right now, including Korea. I know our last speaker was from Korea. What the red line represents is trials of digital therapeutics from the German clinical trial registry. What the blue line represents is trials of digital therapeutics from clinicaltrials.gov, which is the US clinical trial registry. We've normalized the baselines, but what you can see is sort of steady, linear, but not particularly impressive growth in the United States over the last decade. What we see is after the passage of the Digital Healthcare Act, we see a really sort of steep increase in digital therapeutic R&D specific to Germany, which reflects a little bit about where the innovation incentives have landed us. Okay, so what's the work to be done? We still don't understand these products well beyond pivotal trials, is what I said earlier. We've also seen on both sides of the Atlantic quite tepid adoption of real-world data and real-world evidence. For me, this is a massive opportunity for virtual twins and better modeling to actually help us do this well. High-quality real-world data on the performance of digital therapeutics will be vitally important going forward. And in particular, adherence to these tools is notably low, but we know that for people who are adherent, they work really well. But we know virtually nothing about the factors that drive adherence. This is an area I'm excited to dig into. My lab just received a 1.9 million euro grant from the Innovation Fund of the German healthcare system to actually study adherence, because we know basically nothing. And this is obviously of interest to a healthcare system that pays for these tools. And then last, but I think certainly not least, is we actually need to open up the black box of mechanisms of action. With drugs, we understand the mechanisms of action. We see beautiful slides like the ones presented earlier today that actually show, how do these proteins bind? What is this drug actually doing? We understand remarkably little, although we have some glimmers about how digital therapeutics work. We need clear definitions. We need to understand their specific operationalization. We need to understand what is dose realization. So when I administer a drug intravenously to a patient, I know what dose they received. When I administer a digital therapeutic to any of you, I actually don't really, in a clear sense, know what the dose. Maybe I know the dose administered because I know how many minutes of cognitive behavioral therapy training you did, but I don't really know what the realized dose was. And then we need to really understand the factors, but we can do this with data and with data science that drive individual response, as well as things like dose heterogeneity. So I will leave it here. I think we are good on time. And thank you all for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Ariel. Thanks a lot. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Opening to the room. There's one over here.
Before I forget.
Yeah, very nice talk, and especially your vision that, why we are not using data fully when there is so much need, and how Dassault being virtual twin experiences, how it kind of, it's a whole story. So my question is, what's your thought on, because each company thinks that it's their own data, so how do you cross that barrier that, we use the data and still keep it confidential, ethics and everything?
Yeah, so this is the challenge. I think there are two pieces you're addressing, or there are maybe three pieces that you're talking about. One is our general level of comfort with new forms of evidence, and this is something that we as a scientific community just need to do more of. And this goes all the way down, and at every level. Our doctors are not, they learn about RCTs in medical school, and they're not used to necessarily understanding other types of causal inference. Medical journal editors, and in particular the statisticians at medical journals, they're not used to seeing evidence that's not from RCTs. So even if you go to the New England Journal of Medicine, to our colleagues up the road, I did some other work on clinical trial innovation several years ago. There's a hesitancy to accept other types of data. So that's sort of one piece, is this cultural thing. We need to rethink evidence for the 21st century. At the level of individual companies, I think we need to make it, when we have new paradigms and very different approaches on both sides of the Atlantic around data sharing. Of course, as a researcher and as someone who wants us to create, I want us as a society to create the healthcare products that I want to exist in the future when I and my family need them. We need to have more data sharing for this. In Europe, we need a different type of comfort with data sharing. And we need to enable, we need to create the frameworks and the tools and the platforms that actually allow us to do the data science, to do these things. The way this plays out in the United States and Europe will look different. We have the European Health Data Space coming up in Europe, but we also have new opportunities. There is the German Health Data Sharing Law, I don't know the exact English translation, is about 1.5 years old now, that actually explicitly allows for the reuse of data for secondary data use without patient permission for research purposes. So we have all these opportunities, but we need, first of all, we need industry and the people who actually have the right incentives to sort of catch up with what's possible from a regulatory perspective, and then we need this much more dynamic regulatory process where we actually are enabled to use data, especially in ways that actually help health. This is our work for the next decade as a scientific community.
Question here.
Okay. Thank you for that outstanding presentation, Ariel. I had a question about, we see with this first generation of digital therapeutics that are on the market and reimbursed, how many of them have done medico-economic assessment, and how has it impacted the pricing? Because we know, I mean, what we see in France, from what I've understood, is a given price, but expectation from the HTA body, so health tech assessment, that there will be medico-economic assessment.
Yep. So we are, I actually was invited to comment on one such assessment in Germany recently. So many of these products are actually paying external consultancies to do third-party evaluations because they want to show, look, there is real value. So this tool that may only cost you €800 per year per patient is actually creating probably something like, a multiple of that in terms of value per patient. This is extremely, there's settings where this just works really well. So back pain and treatment for back pain, exquisitely expensive. Giving people an app that helps them manage their back pain, if that can stop half of the people from either going back into the clinic or having some sort of orthopedic procedure, that has a very high ROI. And here's my complaint with this, is that the health economists, so this is not the type of health economics I do, but the people that are being hired to do these assessments are taking tools from traditional healthcare economics and applying them to digital therapeutics and to new technologies when there are, and this is where I think the real missed opportunity is, there are a wealth of sources of data available for digital tools. We can be using the metadata from these apps themselves, and yet the industry health economists are doing these exercises as if this is just a drug and all we need to do is extrapolate from the results from the clinical trials. And there are so many much, much, much better and more thoughtful things we could do. And so much data that already exists. We don't have to generate new data sets that would allow us to do a better job of this. So we're seeing more of this activity. You can show ROI for these tools, but I think there's a huge missed opportunity to do a much more thoughtful job.
But by the way, I'm adding to that. Isn't there, for a business standpoint, a linkage between phase 4 and what we can observe from existing real drug and quality of life and the defining of digital therapeutics? So should the business model be linked?
So my short answer is I think we are going to see an increasingly thoughtful linkage between what's going on in traditional pharma and in traditional pharma post-market research and many of these tools, because they just lend themselves together. I've seen there's some really interesting early things going on where traditional pharmaceutical companies are also quite keen to explore digital therapeutics that serve as complementary companions. So if you can, adherence is terrible in pharma. This is like this unspoken secret. Most patients don't take their drugs as prescribed for the period of time they're meant to take them for. If we can increase adherence just to traditional therapeutics by something like 10%,
it's massive.
Massive value for health. It turns out it's a good business case for pharma too.
Let's thank Ariel for this presentation. Thank you so much.